The Spanish Empire was one of the largest empires in the world and became one of the first global empires in world history. It reached the peak of its military, political and economic power under the Spanish Habsburgs, through most of the 16th and 17th centuries, and its greatest territorial extent under the House of Bourbon in the 18th century, when it was the largest empire in the world. The Spanish Empire became the foremost global power of its time and was the first to be called the empire on which the sun never sets. The Spanish Empire originated during the Age of Discovery after the voyages of Christopher Columbus. It comprised territories and colonies of the Spanish monarch in the Americas, Asia, Oceania and Africa as the Greater Antilles, most of South America, Central America and part of North America, as well as a number of Pacific Ocean archipelagos including the Philippines, and it lasted until the early 19th century Spanish-American Wars of Independence, which left only Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines under Spanish rule. Following the Spanish-American War of 1898, Spain ceded its last colonies in the Caribbean and the Pacific to the United States. Its last African colonies were granted independence or abandoned during decolonization of Africa, finishing in 1976. The dynastic union between the Crown of Castile and the Crown of Aragon by the Catholic monarchs initiated a political, religious and social unity to become the first modern state in Europe, known as Catholic monarchy. During this period, the Spanish sovereign acted as monarch in a unitary manner over all his territories through a synodial system of councils, although his power as king or lord varied from one territory to another, since each territory retained its own particular administration and juridical configuration. The unity did not mean uniformity. Therefore, under this political configuration, irrespective of the denominations given to the dynastic union existing from 1580 to 1640, the Portuguese realm kept its own administration and jurisdiction over its territory, as did the other kingdoms and realms ruled by the Spanish Habsburgs. Nevertheless, some historians assert that Portugal was part of the Spanish monarchy at the time, while others draw a clear distinction between the Portuguese and Spanish empires. Origins: Canary Islands. During the 15th century, Castile and Portugal became territorial and commercial rivals in the western Atlantic. Portugal obtained several papal bulls that acknowledged Portuguese control over the discovered territories, but Castile also obtained from the Pope the safeguard of its rights to the Canary Islands with the bulls Romani Pontifex dated 6 November 1436 and Dominus dated 30 April 1437. The conquest of the Canary Islands, inhabited by Guanche people, began in 1402 during the reign of Henry III of Castile, by Norman nobleman Jean de Betancourt under a feudal agreement with the crown. The conquest was completed with the campaigns of the armies of the Crown of Castile between 1478 and 1496, when the islands of Gran Canaria, La Palma, and Tenerife were subjected. Treaty of Alcacovas and the First Colonial War. The Portuguese tried vainly to keep secret the discovery of the Gold Coast in the Gulf of Guinea, but the news quickly caused a huge gold rush. Chronicler Pulgar wrote that the fame of the treasures of Guinea spread around the ports of Andalusia in such way that everybody tried to go there. Worthless trinkets, Moorish textiles, and above all, shells from the Canary and Cape Verde Islands were exchanged for gold, slaves, ivory and Guinea pepper. The War of the Castilian Succession provided the Catholic monarchs with the opportunity not only to attack the main source of the Portuguese power, but also to take possession of this lucrative commerce. The Crown officially organized this trade with Guinea. Every caravel had to get a government license and to pay a tax on 1/5 of the profits. The Castilian fleets fought in the Atlantic Ocean, temporarily occupying the Cape Verde Islands, conquering the city of Ceuta in Tingatana Peninsula in 1476, and even attacked the Azores Islands, being defeated at Praia. But the turning point of the war came in 1478, when a Castilian fleet sent by Ferdinand to conquer Gran Canaria lost men and ships to the Portuguese, who expelled it, and above all, a large Castilian armada, full of gold, was entirely captured in the decisive Battle of Guinea. The Treaty of Alcacovas, while assuring the Castilian throne to the Catholic monarchs, reflected the Castilian naval and colonial defeat. War with Castile broke out, waged savagely in the Gulf until the Castilian fleet of 35 sail was defeated there in 1478. As a result of this naval victory, at the Treaty of Alcacovas in 1479, Castile, while retaining her rights in the Canaries, recognized the Portuguese monopoly of fishing and navigation along the whole West African coast and Portugal's rights over the Madeira, Azores and Cape Verde Islands. The treaty delimited the spheres of influence of the two countries, establishing the principle of the mare clausum. It was confirmed in 1481 by the Pope Sixtus IV, in the papal bull Ite ne Regis. However, this experience would prove to be profitable for the future Spanish overseas expansion, because as the Spaniards were excluded from the lands discovered to be discovered from the Canaries southward, and consequently from the road to India around Africa, they sponsored the Columbus's voyage towards the west in search of Asia to trade in its spices. Thus, the limitations imposed by the Alcacovas Treaty were overcome, and a new and more balanced world's division would be reached at Tordesillas between both emerging maritime powers. Treaty of Tordesillas. 7 months before the Treaty of Alcacovas, King John II of Aragon died, and his son Ferdinand II of Aragon, married to the Queen of Castile, Isabella, inherited the thrones of the Crown of Aragon. The two became known as the Catholic monarchs, with the marriage a personal union that created a relationship between the Crown of Aragon and Castile, each with their own administrations, but ruled jointly by the two monarchs. Ferdinand and Isabella drove the last Moorish king out of Granada in 1492 after a 10-year war. The Catholic monarchs then negotiated with Christopher Columbus, a Genoese sailor attempting to reach Cipangu by sailing west. Castile was already engaged in a race of exploration with Portugal to reach the Far East by sea when Columbus made his bold proposal to Isabella. In the Capitulations of Santa Fe, dated on the 17th of April 1492, Christopher Columbus obtained from the Catholic monarchs his appointment as viceroy and governor in the lands already discovered, and that he might discover thenceforth. Thereby, it was the first document to establish an administrative organization in the Indies. Columbus's discoveries inaugurated the Spanish colonization of the Americas. Spain's claim to these lands was solidified by the Indicayetera papal bull dated the 4th of May 1493, and Dutum Sequitum on the 26th of September 1493, which vested the sovereignty of the territories discovered and to be discovered. Since the Portuguese wanted to keep the line of demarcation of Alcacovas running east and west along a latitude south of Cape Bojador, a compromise was worked out and incorporated in the Treaty of Tordesillas, dated on the 7th of June 1494, in which the globe was split into two hemispheres dividing Spanish and Portuguese claims. These actions gave Spain exclusive rights to establish colonies in all of the New World from north to south, as well as the easternmost parts of Asia. The Treaty of Tordesillas was confirmed by Pope Julius II in the bull Ichque pro bono pacis on the 24th of January 1506. Spain's expansion and colonization was driven by economic influences, a yearning to improve national prestige, and a desire to spread Catholicism into the New World. On the other hand, the Treaty of Tordesillas and the Treaty of Sintra established the limits of the Kingdom of Fez for Portugal, and the Castilian expansion was allowed outside these limits, beginning with the conquest of Melilla in 1497. Struggles for Italy. The Catholic monarchs had developed a strategy of marriages for the children in order to isolate the long-time enemy, France. The Spanish princes married the heirs of Portugal, England and the House of Habsburg. Following the same strategy, the Catholic monarchs decided to support the Catalan-Aragonese House of Naples against Charles VIII of France in the Italian Wars beginning in 1494. His King of Aragon, Ferdinand, had been involved in the struggle against France and Venice for control of Italy. These conflicts became the center of Ferdinand's foreign policy as king. In these battles, which established the supremacy of the Spanish tercios in European battlefields, the forces of the kings of Spain acquired a reputation for invincibility that would last until the mid-17th century. After the death of Queen Isabella, Ferdinand, as Spain's sole monarch, adopted a more aggressive policy than he had as Isabella's husband, enlarging Spain's sphere of influence in Italy and against France. Ferdinand's first deployment of Spanish forces came in the War of the League of Cambrai against Venice, where the Spanish soldiers distinguished themselves on the field alongside the French allies at the Battle of Agnadello. Only a year later, Ferdinand became part of the Holy League against France, seeing a chance at taking both Milan, to which he held a dynastic claim, and Navarre. This war was less of a success than the war against Venice, and in 1516, France agreed to a truce that left Milan in its control and recognized Spanish control of Upper Navarre. Papal bulls and the Indies. The papal bull Intercaetera of 1493 by Alexander VI of Valencia, known as Rodrigo Borgia before his election as Pope, vested government and jurisdiction of newly found lands in the kings of Castile and Leon and the successors. According to the Concord of Segovia of 1475, Ferdinand was mentioned in the bulls as King of Castile, and upon his death the title of the Indies was to be incorporated into the crown of Castile. The territories were incorporated by the Catholic monarchs as jointly held assets. In the Treaty of Villafafula of 1506, Ferdinand renounced not only the government of Castile in favor of his son-in-law Philip I of Castile but also the lordship of the Indies, withholding a half of the income of the kingdoms of the Indies. Joanna of Castile and Philip immediately added to their titles the kingdoms of Indies, islands and mainland of the Ocean Sea. But the Treaty of Villafafula did not hold for long because of the death of Philip. Ferdinand returned as regent of Castile and as lord-The Indies, according to the domain granted by papal bulls and the wills of Queen Isabella of Castile in 1504 and King Ferdinand of Aragon in 1516. Such property became held by the Crown of Castile. This arrangement was ratified by successive monarchs, beginning with Charles I in 1519 in a decree that spelt out the juridical status of the new overseas territories. The lordship of the discovered territories conveyed by papal bulls was private to the kings of Castile and Leon. The political condition of the Indies were to transform from lordship of the Catholic monarchs to kingdoms for the heirs of Castile. Although the Alexandrine bulls gave full, free and omnipotent power to the Catholic monarchs, they did not rule them as a private property but as a public property through the public bodies and authorities from Castile. And when those territories were incorporated into the Crown of Castile, the royal power was subject to the laws of Castile. First settlements in the Americas and crown control with the capitulations of Santa Fe. The Crown of Castile granted expansive power to Christopher Columbus, including exploration, settlement, political power, and revenues, with sovereignty reserved to the Crown. The first voyage established sovereignty for the Crown, and the Crown acted on the assumption that Columbus's grandiose assessment of what he found was true. So Spain negotiated the Treaty of Tordesillas with Portugal to protect the territory on the Spanish side of the line. The Crown fairly quickly reassessed its relationship with Columbus and moved to assert more direct Crown control over the territory and extinguish his privileges. With that lesson learned, the Crown was far more prudent in specifying the terms of exploration, conquest, and settlement in new areas. The pattern in the Caribbean that played out over the larger Spanish Indies was exploration of an unknown area and claim of sovereignty for the Crown, conquest of indigenous peoples or assumption of control without direct violence, settlement by Spaniards who rewarded the labor of indigenous people via the encomienda, and the existing settlements becoming the launch point for further exploration, conquest, and settlement, followed by the establishment institutions with officials appointed by the Crown. The patterns set in the Caribbean were replicated throughout the expanding Spanish sphere. So although the importance of the Caribbean quickly faded after the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire and the Spanish conquest of the Incas, many of those participating in those conquests had started their exploits in the Caribbean. The first permanent European settlements in the New World were established in the Caribbean, initially on the island of Hispaniola, later Cuba and Puerto Rico. As a Genoese with the connections to Portugal, Columbus considered settlement to be on the pattern of trading forts and factories, with salaried employees to trade with locals and to identify exploitable resources. However, Spanish settlement in the New World was based on a pattern of a large, permanent settlements with the entire complex of institutions and material life to replicate Castilian life in a different venue. Columbus's second voyage in 1493 had a large contingent of settlers and goods to accomplish that. On Hispaniola, the city of Santo Domingo was founded in 1496 by Christopher Columbus's brother Bartholomew Columbus and became a stone-built, permanent city. Although Columbus staunchly asserted and believed that the lands he encountered were in Asia, the paucity of material wealth and the relative lack of complexity of indigenous society meant that the Crown of Castile initially was not concerned with the extensive powers granted Columbus. However, as the Caribbean became a draw for Spanish settlement and as Columbus and his extended Genoese family failed to be recognized as officials worthy of the titles they held, there was unrest. Columbus encountered the mainland in 1498, and the Catholic monarchs learned of his discovery in May 1499. Taking advantage of the revolt against Columbus Indiana Hispaniola, they appointed Francisco de Bobadilla as governor of the Indies with civil and criminal jurisdiction over the lands discovered by Columbus. Bobadilla, however, was soon replaced by Nicolas de Rovando in September 1501. Henceforth, the Crown would authorize to individuals voyages to discover territories in the Indies only with previous royal license, and after 1503 the monopoly of the Crown was assured by the establishment of Casa de Contratación at Seville. The successors of Columbus, however, litigated against the Crown until 1536 for the fulfillment of the capitulations of Santa Fe in the Plitos Columbianos. Torremolinos. In metropolitan Spain, the direction of the Indies was taken over by the Bishop Fonseca between 1493 and 1516, and again between 1518 and 1524, after a brief period of rule by Jean Le Sauvage. After 1504 the figure of the secretary was added, so between 1504 and 1507 Gaspar de Grisio took charge. Between 1508 and 1518 Lope de Conquillos followed him, and from 1519, Francisco de los Cobos. In 1511, the Junta of the Indies was constituted as a standing committee belonging to the Council of Castile to address issues of the Indies, and this junta constituted the origin of the Council of the Indies in 1524. Following the settlement of Hispaniola, which was successful towards the end of the 1490s, the settlers began searching elsewhere to begin new settlements. Since there was little apparent wealth and the numbers of indigenous were declining, those from the less prosperous Hispaniola were eager to search for new success in a new settlement. For the Juan Ponce de Leon conquered Puerto Rico and Diego Velázquez took Cuba. In 1508, the Board of Navigators met in Burgos concurred the need to establish settlements on the mainland, a project entrusted to Alonso de Ojeda and Diego de Niqueza as governors, subordinated to the governor of Hispaniola, who was the newly appointed Diego Columbus with the same legal authority as Ovando. The first settlement on the mainland was Santa Maria la Antigua del Darien in Castilla de Oro, settled by Vasco Núñez de Balboa in 1510. In 1513, Balboa crossed the Isthmus of Panama and led the first European expedition to see the Pacific Ocean from the west coast of the New World. In an action with enduring historical import, Balboa claimed the Pacific Ocean and all the lands adjoining it for the Spanish crown. The Judgment of Seville of May 1511 recognized the viceregal title to Diego Columbus, but limited it to Hispaniola and to the islands discovered by his father, Christopher Columbus. His power was nevertheless limited by royal offices and magistrates constituting a dual regime of government. Therefore, King Ferdinand II of Aragon, as regent of his daughter the Queen Joanna, separated the territories of the mainland, designated as Castilla de Oro, for the Viceroy of Hispaniola, establishing as General Lieutenant to Pedrarias de Villa in 1513, with functions similar to those of a viceroy, remaining Balboa subordinated as governing of Panama and Coiba on the Pacific coast, and that after his death returned to Castilla de Oro. The territory of Castilla de Oro did not include either Veragua. Due to this, territory was subject to a lawsuit between the Crown and Diego Columbus, or the region farther north, towards the Yucatan Peninsula, explored by Yanez Pinzon and Solis in 1508 to 1509 due to its remoteness. The conflicts of the Viceroy Columbus with the royal offices and with the Audiencia, created in Santo Domingo in 1511, caused his return to the peninsula in 1515. Campaigns in Africa. After the conquest of Melilla in 1497, the Spanish expansionist policy in North Africa was developed during the regency of Ferdinand the Catholic in Castile, stimulated by the Cardinal Cisneros. Once the reconquista in the Iberian Peninsula was finished, that way, several towns and outposts in the North African coast were conquered and occupied by Castile, Mazalquivir, Penon de Ve Acute Elized de la Gomera, Oran, Algiers, Baguia, and Tripoli. In the Atlantic coast, Spain took possession of the outpost of Santa Cruz de la Marpequena with support from the Canary Islands, and it was retained until 1525 with the consent of the Treaty of Sintra.